Our reading this morning will be taken from Genesis chapter 27, and Brother Mark will come down and read that for us. We look forward now to the word of exhortation, where we can meditate upon the things of God, and hopefully with all of us, it will make a difference in the days, the minutes, the hours, whatever's left to us that lie ahead. So we'll ask now Simon Peel to come forward and give us his exhortation on the theme of oaths.
Thank you very much for inviting us, and thank you for providing the babysitting service this morning as well to Alaska. For the first time, Hannah and I, for a long time, managed to go out for breakfast, so we very much appreciate you having her for Sunday school this morning as well. I bring the greetings of Wadigans, who are supposed to meet at 11:15, but realistically are probably only just starting as we get our act together with technology and stuff. Still trying to get the hang of it. Okay, Genesis 27. So there's a thing that the kids do as one of their first acts of deception. And thankfully, Alaska hasn't quite worked out how to do it yet, but it will come. So the deception is to ask one of the parents if they can have something, only to receive no as the answer. So then go and ask the other parent and see if they can get a better answer. So in the very near future, Alaska is likely to ask Hannah for chocolate, and Hannah will say no. And then she'll come to me and ask the same question, and I will say, well, what did Mummy say? And Alaska will say, she said yes. And so I then, okay, you can have the chocolate, and I will go and get the chocolate. Now, if Hannah comes into the kitchen as I'm about to give Alaska the chocolate and tells me that she actually had said no, what is the correct course of parenting that we should then do? Obviously, Alaska does not get the chocolate, and we tell her off for trying to be sneaky. It would be strange if we still gave her the chocolate because I had promised it to her, and it was more important that the promise be fulfilled than for Alaska to learn that there are bad consequences for naughtiness. To be over-analytical about it, the promise I gave her was based on an assumption that wasn't correct. Namely, that Hannah had already agreed that Alaska could have chocolate. Once I found out that the assumption was incorrect and I'd been deceived, the promise becomes null and void. So what's the point of me laboring this point? Well, Genesis 27 was part of the readings maybe a month or so ago, and I have a Bible class at Wadigans on Isaac, so I was paying particular attention to it, and the blessing of Jacob and Esau and the trickery involved has always struck me as a little bit odd. Isaac's blessing is given based on an assumption that isn't correct. So when Isaac finds out that Jacob has deceived him, why doesn't Isaac call Jacob back in, give him a clip round the ear and say, you're grounded for a month for being wicked? Why doesn't Isaac renege on his blessing? Because he obviously hadn't intended it to go to Jacob. The blessing was given based on an assumption that wasn't correct. The assumption being, of course, that he was blessing Esau, not Jacob. Surely everyone would understand that this isn't acceptable behavior, and that God would understand that the blessing needed to be redone, right? But nothing of the sort happens. The blessings stand and are accepted despite them going to the wrong son. And the dedication to deception that Jacob and Rebekah are willing to undertake is pretty mind-blowing. I'm imagining there's a family unit there with servants and whatnot, but there's a family unit that is potentially just going to get blown apart because of this deception. That's a high risk to take. Also, Jacob's voice is different. And Isaac is suspicious and almost blows the whole thing up when he questions the speed at which the animal was caught and prepared. It's a bit like Hannah asking me to go to Coles and get eggs, and I go to the chicken coop at the end of the garden instead and return and say, well, the Lord just blessed me. It's like, no, hang on. The timing doesn't work here. but they get away with it. And Isaac truly believes it is Esau that he is blessing. Because when the truth is revealed, it says in verse 33 that he trembled violently. To me, that's not a reaction of a man who had worked out what was going on and still went ahead with it. That's the reaction of a man who has been deceived by his children, by what is one of his children. And Rebekah and Jacob were obviously under the impression that all they had to do was get Isaac to say the words to the wrong son, and the deception would be complete and irreversible. At no point does it seem that they considered that Isaac could just null and void the blessing and redo it. Genesis 27 and verse 38. Esau said to his father, "Have you but one blessing, my father? Bless me, even me also, O my father." And Esau lifted up his voice and wept. So Esau doesn't even consider asking Isaac to overturn the blessing. He understood that that just wasn't an option. Even Esau treated his father's words as if they were sacred, even though he was the one who was done wrong. They can't be added to, they cannot be taken away, they are finite and they cannot be unsaid. For want of a better analogy, they're like a genie has been let out of the bottle and you cannot put them back in again. And Isaac then goes on to give a pretty bleak prophecy for Esau. And it's not a vague prophecy either, it's specific. It says he will serve his brother. The blessing he mistakenly gives to Jacob also specifically mentions that he will be lord over his brothers. Now, obviously, Isaac's original intention was for Jacob to serve Esau. Isaac wanted the blessing in verse 27 to 29 to apply to Esau and for nations to bow down to him. Isaac wanted Jacob to dwell away from the earth's richness and live by the sword, as it's laid out in verses 39 and 40. Isaac wanted those blessings to go to the other children than what they actually did. So what makes those words binding? What makes them unchangeable? And my opinion is that Isaac is in control of what he's saying. We don't read anywhere that Isaac consulted with God as to what to say. We don't read that God or an angel told him what to say. Jacob is not accused of deceiving God, only of deceiving Isaac. And in verse 37, when Isaac is explaining to Esau what's happened, he says, "I have made him lord over you." Not God has made him lord over you. I have done it. It seems to me that Isaac is in full control of the blessing. And when Rebekah is telling Jacob what she has heard Isaac saying to Esau, if you can follow that, when Jacob tells sorry, it doesn't help that I messed the names up. When Rebekah tells Jacob what she has heard Isaac saying to Esau, she quotes Isaac as saying, "So that I may give my blessing in the presence of the Lord." It gives the impression that the angel is in the corner watching how this is going to play out. It's not the Lord doing it in the presence of Isaac. It's Isaac doing it in the presence of the Lord. To me, gives the impression that Isaac is in full control here. So hypothetical situation for you then. What if Isaac decided to redo the blessings because he'd been tricked? Would the second blessings have had any effect on the future? Or would the first ones have been the binding ones, no matter the patch-up job Isaac would have tried to do afterwards by redoing them? Which set of blessings would God have accepted? So we'll try and come back to that and answer that question shortly. In the meantime, let's go to Judges chapter 11. and a story I'm sure we all know well. Judges 11 and verses 30 and 31. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord and said, if you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whatever comes out from the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. And on to verse 34. Then Jephthah came to his home at Mizpah, and behold, his daughter came out to meet him with tambourines and with dances. She was his only child. Beside her, he had neither son nor daughter. And as soon as he saw her, he tore his clothes and said, alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low, and you have become the cause of great trouble for me. For I have opened my mouth to the Lord, and I cannot take back my vow. Well, why not? Why doesn't Jephthah believe he can take his vow back? He clearly wasn't thinking that his daughter would come out first. Surely God would understand and would accept a sacrifice of the first animal instead that came out of the house, seeing as that's clearly what he intended. Why did Jephthah think that his vow was unbreakable, even though the results were outside of his original intentions? Is God really watching this whole scene and thinking, well, you didn't think that one through, did you? Is God really putting the need to fulfill a vow above the sacrifice of an innocent child? Now, I know there are opinions about what actually happened to her. Did she actually get offered a burnt offering as he said he would, or does she go into a life of service to the Lord instead? I'm not going to get into it, and it's not really that important in this case, in what I'm trying to say. The important thing is that Jephthah is clearly distraught about how his vow has not gone according to plan. So why are oaths, vows, and promises so highly thought of in Scripture? Why is there this understanding that these things are unbreakable, even if that means that Esau wants to kill his brother? And Jephthah's daughter, in the most awful implications or reading of the passage, is killed. Why is the vow more important? Let's go to 1 Samuel 25. (1 Samuel 25) and verses 21 and 22. And this chapter is about Abigail and Nabal. 1 Samuel 25, verses 21 and 22. Now David had said, surely in vain have I guarded all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him, and he has returned to me evil for good. God, do so to the enemies of David, more and more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him. So David and his men had been looking after Nabal's shepherds and their sheep, and they asked for some food in return, and Nabal says no. So David goes off his head and makes this really rash promise. It's a very rash thing to say. In a fit of anger, David vows to kill the men of an entire household because of one man's foolishness. And he makes the promise, and he's about to go and fulfill it until the intervention of Nabal's wife, Abigail. Because of her apology on Nabal's behalf and her desperate attempt to make up for her husband's idiocy, David changes his mind. And we read that in verses 32 and 34. And David said to Abigail, blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you who have kept me this day from blood guilt and from working salvation with my own hand. David himself realizes his impetuousness and thanks God for Abigail's intercession. But why is he allowed to break his vow? The NIV says, David says, may God deal with me, be it ever so severely. That's a powerful expression to take lightly enough to just change your mind. David invites God to inflict extreme punishment on him if he goes back on his promise. And then he goes back on his promise. So does that mean that this phrase, may God deal with me be it ever so severely, is actually just a throwaway phrase? It doesn't actually mean anything. You kind of just say it to make it sound your promise is more binding. And that phrase is used a fair bit. The KJV renders it, God do so and more. And another place it occurs is a few chapters back in chapter 14, where King Saul makes a rash promise in verse 24. So 1 Samuel 14, verse 24. And the men of Israel had been hard pressed that day. So Saul had laid an oath on the people, saying, cursed be the man who eats food until it is evening, and I am avenged on my enemies. So none of the people had tasted food. And of course, his son Jonathan is unaware of this curse and eats some honey and tries to encourage the men around him to eat some as well. And at this point, the men tell Jonathan of Saul's oath. So verse 44 and 45 is interesting. And Saul said, God do to me and more also. So that's that phrase, may God deal with me be it ever so severely. God do so to me and more also. You shall surely die, Jonathan. Then the people said to Saul, shall Jonathan die, who has worked this great salvation in Israel? Far from it. As the Lord lives, there shall not be one hair of his head that falls to the ground, for he has worked with God this day. So the people ransomed Jonathan so that he did not die. So the men refuse to recognize Saul's oath as valid. He's gone too far. Even though he has uttered this phrase, may God deal with me, be it ever so severely. Jonathan is saved because the men stood up to Saul and his reckless oath, and by his silence, by Saul's silence, we assume that he also accepted this correction. Leviticus chapter 5 has some laws on oaths that you make. Leviticus chapter 5, verses 4 and 5. Says, if anyone utters with his lips a rash oath to do evil or to do good, any sort of rash oath that people swear, and it is hidden from him, when he comes to know it and he realizes his guilt in any of these, when he realizes his guilt in any of these and confesses the sin he has committed, he shall then offer a sacrifice. So there's provision in the law for swearing an oath carelessly. I put it to you that David understood this and Jephthah didn't. I believe that Jephthah could have taken his oath back. They were rash. According to Leviticus, he had made a rash oath. He could have taken back his rash words and carried out his intended oath and sacrificed an animal instead. Leviticus tells us that if you made a vow that you came to realize was stupid, you could swallow your pride and confess that you made a rash decision and it could be wiped away. So we as human beings can do and say some very silly things. And God understands this. We also need to understand this. Leviticus 5 says, when you become aware that you are guilty of making a rash oath. So recognizing your guilt is essential. Recognizing our own stupidity is essential. That's the difference between Nabal and David. At no point does Nabal recognize his own foolishness. But David does recognize his own foolishness once Abigail points it out to him. His pride, David's pride, could have got the better of him, and he could have just carried on and carried out his threat and massacred that entire household. But instead, he praises Abigail and God for stopping him before it was too late. So if you were to distill down the mercy of God, I think it comes down to this. He offers us a way out of our own stupidity. Isaiah 11. Isaiah 11 and verses 3 and 4, obviously talking about, at this point, the coming Lord Jesus. Verse 3, and his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what he sees or decide disputes by what his ears hear. But with righteousness, he will judge the needy. So Jesus can see through our impulses and forgive our off-the-cuff remarks that we regret as long as we recognize that we've been foolish. He says, I won't judge by the silly things you do and say, as long as you recognize that you're needy, and then I will judge you with righteousness. But you have to know that you're needy, that you need my righteous judgment. Once you accept that you make and do these stupid things, I won't judge you for them. At first reading of Genesis 27, of Isaac blessing Esau and Jacob, Rebekah seems to get a bad rap because of her decision to instigate the deception. And the fact that she convinces Jacob to go along with it, despite him having reservations and getting caught. She seems very offhand and careless when she says to Jacob, let the curse fall on me. If you get caught, I'll take the blame for that. If you come back to Genesis 25, I discovered this when I was doing this talk, and maybe you knew this already, but I'll assume you are a bit naive like me. Genesis 25, verse 23. And the Lord said to her, which is Rebekah, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, the older shall serve the younger. So it was already prophesied that Esau would serve Jacob. So when Isaac is intent on blessing Esau instead of Jacob, we can see that actually Rebekah is taking matters into her own hands to make sure that this prophecy comes true. Her apparent cavalier attitude to getting a curse is more likely down to her confidence that her plan will work, because this is the last chance for the prophecy to be fulfilled before Isaac dies. So actually, Isaac is the one who should be getting a bad rap. He is deliberately trying to ignore the prophecy given to Rebekah and twist it to suit his favorite son instead. It is only Rebekah's intervention that means things are done as they are meant to. Now, Isaac doesn't explicitly thank Rebekah for forcing him to do the right thing, but in chapter 28, he again blesses Jacob, this time intentionally, and asks God to make Jacob fruitful and to inherit the blessings of Abraham. So he has accepted and encourages Jacob to being the true inheritor. Sometimes we can be like Isaac. We know the expectations of God, but it doesn't suit us. Isaac knew the prophecy that had been given to Rebekah about Esau serving Jacob, but Esau was his favorite, and it didn't sit well with him. So he tried to take things into his own hands. The Bible has some uncomfortable things that it expects us to do. God expects us to care for the poor, to obey the authorities, to pay our taxes, to forgive when it hurts, to be humble when we're wrong. all of which should make us squirm in our seats because we really don't like doing any of those things. Sometimes we can be like Jephthah. We can say something that hurts us and others and yet refuse to back down. By being so stubborn, we can lose those who are closest to us. Sometimes we can be like David. We can also say something impetuous that hurts others and us. And yet, when it is pointed out to us, we can humble ourselves and praise God that he cares enough about us that he will use others to stop us from going down a destructive path. So having looked at these oaths and vows and the damage they did or could have caused, it's interesting that Jesus condemns oath-taking outright. If you go to Matthew 5, we can see his teaching on this. Matthew chapter 5 and verses 33 to 37. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything else comes from evil. So don't keep people guessing. Be trustworthy, be reliable. If we have to convince someone that we mean what we say by saying an oath, then our character isn't of good enough standing. If Hannah asks me to take the rubbish out and I say I will, she then looks at me suspiciously and I have to say something like, look, I swear on my life that I will take the rubbish out. The fact that I need to say that to convince her shows that there's been too many times that I've promised to do it and I haven't done it. If my yes had been yes and I took the rubbish out every time I said I wouldn't have to qualify it with an oath. My yes would be yes. And we know the Pharisees were very good at wheedling out of promises. They'd orchestrated this way of saying oaths that didn't really mean anything. In Matthew 23, as part of Jesus' tirade against them, he exposes their hypocrisy, that if you swear by the temple or the altar, then it doesn't actually mean anything. But if you swear by the gold of the temple or the sacrifice on the altar, then you're bound by what you have promised. So what's the point of that? Well, I think it was because the people didn't understand that difference. So you could swear by the temple and sound very trustworthy, and the average person would believe you because they weren't aware of this little nuance of this law. So a Pharisee can make a promise. You'd be like, oh, great, he's promised it. When actually there was no intention of carrying out what had been promised at all. So sometimes we can be like Pharisees. We want to sound important and helpful and trustworthy, but actually have no intention of fulfilling what we had promised. But sometimes we can be like Jesus. In our best moments, we can be the people God expects us to be. We can be honest and trustworthy. We can be selfless and inspiring. We can stay strong and faithful, even when things get really tough. So when those of us who were baptized, we took an oath, essentially, to serve God and to serve Jesus until the end. Each week we come to renew that oath. Every time we ask for forgiveness, we renew that oath. And that oath is not like an insurance company when you think you're covered and then you read the small print and they've included something that probably means you don't get the payout. We can't promise to follow Jesus only to have a list of terms and conditions. I promise to follow Jesus and do all that God asks of me, except when there's a pandemic on and the authorities ask me to get a test at the mildest symptoms, But I'm a casual employee, and if I go and get a test, then I won't get paid. So I'll just ignore this little tickle in my throat. I promise to follow God and do all that God asks of me, except when someone has had a disagreement with me and it's a bit awkward and I have to treat them like Jesus expects me to treat them, like my brother and sister. I'll follow Jesus except in that moment. I promise to follow Jesus and do all that God asks of me, except when it's really hard to forgive someone. There are no terms and conditions with our oath to follow Jesus. We have said yes to him and no to the world. Yes to God, no to ourselves. I promise to follow Jesus and do all that God asks of me, even when life is really tough and I feel very alone. I promise to follow Jesus and do all that God asks of me, even if I keep getting it wrong and I have to ask for forgiveness multiple times a day. Let's go to Psalm 15 as our final passage. And it's a short psalm, so we'll read the whole thing. So Psalm 15 says, O Lord, who shall sojourn in your tent? Who shall dwell on your holy hill? Well, it's these people. He who walks blamelessly and does what is right and speaks truth in his heart, who does not slander with his tongue and does no evil to his neighbor, nor takes up a reproach against his friend, in whose eyes a vile person is despised, but who honors those who fear the Lord, who keeps an oath even if it hurts and does not change it, who does not put out his money at interest and does not take a bribe against the innocent. He who does all these things shall never be moved. So as we take the bread and wine this morning, we remember a man who was never shaken, who never wavered from his promise to fulfill God's will, even to the point of torture and death. This is the man we say yes to. This is the man that we celebrate as our Savior.